Hello guys, and welcome back to Joe's Ventures. And today we're doing another episode of our Planet Zoo mod spotlight, where we take a look at some of the wonderful mods people have been making and use them to talk about some of the wonderful biodiversity that we share our world with. So today we've got a bit of interesting assortment. We've got some extinct animals, we've got a reptile, we've got some ungulates and some primates. So yeah, really excited to get stuck into this one. So I'm not going to dilly-dally too much. Let's get started. We're going to have a look today. Our first animal is done by Leaf and Megarex Gaming. We have got the Emerald Tree Monitor. So really cool animal here, obviously based off the new Asian Water Monitor. So the Emerald Tree Monitor, or also known as the Green Tree Monitor, these guys are a small or medium-sized arboreal monitor lizard that is known for its unusual colors, which can range from turquoise to green, which is quite interesting. And this banding that you can see goes on them, and that helps with camouflage. So, yeah. In terms of their evolutionary history, these guys are obviously part of Varanidae, so they're related to other Varanids. So, like Komodo dragons, things like that. They're on the same genus Varanus. And typically, these guys can be found in New Guinea, between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, as well as the several islands such as the Torres Strait Islands. And they've also been reported to thrive in lowland environments, so they like tropical evergreen forests and palm swamps and even cocoa plantations. So it's pretty interesting. So in terms of their description, they get to about 75 to 100 centimeters, or about 30 to 39 inches long, with a long and slender body like this that allows them to support itself on even narrow branches. And they use their prehensile tail and long claws to cling onto these branches. And unlike other varanids, they actually do not use their tail to defend. They'll use its tail, defends its tail rather than like whacking with its tail, because it's quite important for them when they're climbing. So when they're threatened, they'll actually kind of avoid whipping you, for example. And the sole of the feet of the Emerald Green Tree Monitor are actually enlarged, in large scales, and which aids them in their climbing. So in terms of ecology, these guys will typically flee into vegetation when threatened, and they're actually one of the few social monitors. So these guys actually live in a little bit of a social life. They will live in small groups, which is made up of a dominant male, several females, and a few other males and juveniles. So it's quite interesting there. And in terms of their diet, these guys consistently feed on tree-dwelling invertebrates or arthropods, such as like katydids, grasshoppers, cockroaches, beetles, centipedes, spiders, and crabs. But they'll also eat birds and small mammals, so pretty much on that seafood diet. And before they swallow stick insects, they'll actually bite them and tear off the legs. And captive specimens will actually tear off the limbs of rodents before eating them. And as a result, they're capable of actually swallowing some quite big animals, like a 135-gram lizard can swallow a 40-gram rodent, which is quite interesting. And there's also been some people that have observed emerald tree monitors eating fruits or bananas in captivity, so they may have a little bit of fruit in their diet, which is quite interesting. Let's have a look at the babies, and then we can talk about their reproduction. Let's look at the cuties here. A little juvenile. So clutches typically consist of like 5 eggs, each weighing about 10 to 11 grams, and they measure about 2 to 4.5 centimeters, or about 0.37 to 0.41 ounces, and 79 to 1.77 inches. And they can lay as many as 3 clutches throughout the year. And clutches have been laid before in captives in January, March, April, November, and December. And the female emerald tree monitor typically would lay her eggs in arboreal termite mounds or termite nests. And these eggs will typically hatch about 160 to 190 days afterwards, typically from June to November. Which the young will actually eat the termites within minutes of hatching, and then they reach their age of sexual maturity at about a year of age. So yeah, really cool, nice monitor. I'm a really big fan of that. Great job, Leaf and Megarex Gaming. Really awesome to see that. So next we're moving on to a primate. This one's got a bit of a remaster, because as you can see, it's a wonderful face going on here. It's the Red-shanked Douc, which is a type of langur. So these guys are an arboreal old world monkey, and they are Columbine family, so they're related to like other langurs, things like that. They are endemic to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and are quite known for their, as you can see, quite bright colors, and they express some quite interesting sexual dimorphism, as we'll get into. So as I mentioned, these guys live in Indochina, so Vietnam, Laos, and probably Cambodia, about east of the Mekong River, and the only species of dock that actually lives within all three countries of Indochina, which is quite interesting. In terms of the habitat, these guys are typically found in evergreen forests or even limestone forests up to about 16,000 meters. And they're arboreal, and they'll spend most of their time in the forest canopy as well. And they will occasionally come down to get food, like drink water and eat dirt that contains minerals occasionally, but they typically will spend most of their time within the trees. And apparently they have an average home range of about 36 hectares, or about 89 acres, and a victoria of about 8 acres that'll shrink and change during the dry and wet season, depending on resources. But similar to other Donyx, these guys are quite lanky or long, slender monkeys. They have a head to body length of about 55 to 82 centimeters, or about 22 to 32 inches, and a tail that measures 56 to 74 centimeters, or about 20 to 29 inches. In females and males, females are a little bit shorter, about 66 to 3 or 20 to 25 inches. In terms of weight, males typically get quite a bit bigger. Males will weigh between 8 and 11 kilograms, or about 90 to 25 pounds, and females 6.6 to 10 kilograms, or about 5 to 23 pounds. So, as you can see, they often get the name the Queen of Primates because they're such colourful animals and look really, really interesting, and they've quite a distinct appearance. So you can see they've got like this agouti hair down their legs and things like that. Then they have the grey bits on their arms there and their flanks and sides. And then you can see they've got white along the front of their hands, and then the grey, and they've got this really interesting kind of like mane going on as well. The fur on their cheeks is white as well. Really gives them an interesting look. And typically, as they get into lower latitudes, they have less vibrant colours as well. And although they do have minor sexual dimorphism, with females being slightly smaller than males, and there's some slight differences in coloration between males and females, but it's not too obvious. But yeah, really, really interesting, distinct looking monkey. And I know you're walking into each other. We don't want that. But where's another one? There's the other one. Oh, there we are. So yeah, in terms of behavior, they often will communicate a lot with facial expressions and all that, similar to other monkeys, as they have a play face with their mouth will open and their teeth will be partially bared. Things like closing its eyes and paws blinky. Closes eyes and paws and blindly towards another Donyx, which actually, without regard of hazards, doing so, things like that. And they have all sorts of other displays and things like not looking each other in the eyes, things like that. It's a common monkey thing to establish dominance, things like that. And they're fairly peaceful, and antagonistic behavior has actually not been recorded very often, though there has been instances in zoos where they have had kind of fights. But typically they groom and they have alloparental care, which means animals will take care of babies that aren't theirs, which is quite cool. In terms of group composition, they live in complex fusion-fission societies, so they live in groups that are constantly changing. Typically, it'll be one male, multi-female, or multi-male, multi-female groups, with male to female ratios like 1 to 1.6 each, and like 1, 1, 1, things like that. So typically, a band can have about 18 individuals or so, and groups of 50 have even been reported, but they obviously change all the time. They change due to seasons, and both males and females will have their own dominance hierarchies within these social groups, which is quite interesting. And another interesting about these guys' locomotion, they use brachiation almost half the time, so they're a species that brachiates quite a lot. And juveniles use arm swinging a lot, especially when they're younger. Adult females will also use it, but mainly kind of like juveniles will use it. And when they travel on foot, their tail will usually hang down, and they don't have prehensile tails like a lot of New World monkeys, so they don't use it to like climb and things like that, but they're still quite adept at climbing, things like that. And in terms of mating, these guys in captivity will reach sexual maturity about 4 years of age, and males about 4 years and 8 months, so about 4 or 5 years. Mating will occur between August and December, and mating is initiated by both genders, jutting their jaws forward, and they raise and lower their eyebrows. It's kind of like, hey, look at me. And then what will happen is they have an average menstrual cycle of 26.4 days, and then Births will occur year-round, but they typically peak in August to October, and then again in February to April. The birth interval is about 16 to 38 months, and the gestation period is about 165 to 210 days, which usually they'll give birth to a single offspring, but sometimes they'll give birth to twins. Speaking of that, we'll have a look at the babies here. Look at this little cutie. Yeah. Usually this has been observed in captivity, and they can live for up to 20 to 30 years, so quite long-lived. And when these young are born, their eyes are open instantly, and they can latch to their mothers instinctively as well. And you can see the baby's body coloration is quite a bit lighter than the adults and a bit more beige, but as they get older, their face will lighten up and their bodies will darken, as for example, things like that. And in terms of their diet, these guys are frugivores or like a folivores, so they eat a lot of fruits and leaves and things like that. They'll consume mostly buds and young leaves and other plant parts, things like that. And they'll also feed on different things during the year, so they're able to feed. They're selective feeders and flexible eaters because they eat a wide range of food in all seasons. So while they only mainly eat like food, buds and things like that, they will eat a lot of other things. So it's quite cool. They have different eating patterns during the year, so some will eat figs all year. They'll feed on different things in different parts of the plants, so they're quite generous in that regard. But they all eat peacefully together. They'll share food, so they get on quite well with other members of their group, things like that. But in terms of their conservation, they are sadly critically endangered, and we'll get to why. Because in 2020, they're thought to be critically endangered because of declines and things like that. The main threats to these guys in the wild include hunting, because their meat is used for food and traditional medicines, and they're sold internationally as well. And local people often hunt these species for pets or consumption or looking to make glue. But it's believed about 50 of these monkeys are killed each year, which is pretty sad. The other main threats are the pet trade. Obviously, people want to catch them for pets. Also, habitat fragmentation, destroying of their forests that they need, agricultural land, and military installations being big issue to these guys. But Laos luckily has the biggest population of these guys, and has been considered quite important for their conservation. And there isn't great conservation actions in Laos. There've been effort to breed them in captivity because they're quite difficult. There's only about 33 captive docs in the world. But luckily, there are some efforts trying to protect areas they live in and things like that. So, yeah. Luckily, it's not all lost for these guys. There's still a fighting chance. Really, really cool animal. This guy was done by Leaf and Monsoon. Really, really awesome. Next up, we've got by Narwhal and Monsoon, we have got the Markhor. So this is one that's kind of returning it's got a facelift. Which is quite interesting. Let's have a little looky-loo at these guys. So let's have a look at the male here. So the Markhor, these guys are a large species of goat that live in Central Asia and the Himalayas as well. So it's quite interesting. In terms of their body size, these guys stand at about 65 to 115 centimeters tall. Let's see if I can find. Yeah, centimeters tall, and weigh about 32 to 110 kilograms, about 71 to 243 pounds, and actually have the highest maximum shoulder height among all species of the genus, which is only surpassed in length and weight by the Siberian ibex. The coat, as you can see, there is quite grizzled with light brown to black colors, and you can also see they're quite sexual dimorphic. So males will have these long chin hairs that you can see that's quite well represented down here, and these really, really large horns. But females, as you can see as well, will have a look at typically redder in color and things like that. And they have these tight horns, but the males one's quite big. They can get up to about 160 centimeters or about 63 inches, and up to 25 centimeters or 10 inches of females, which is quite interesting. So in terms of their behavior and ecology, these guys are quite well adapted to mountainous terrain and can be found at up to 600 to 3,600 feet, or about 2,000 to 11,000 feet in elevation, where they live in scrub forests with oaks and pines and things like that. They're also diurnal, so they're mostly out during the day doing their thing. And their diets will shift a lot seasonally, so they'll graze in the summer and then browse in the winter. And sometimes they'll even stand on their hind legs to reach these branches. In terms of gestation, these guys, when they're obviously breeding, they'll fight each other, especially the big males. And then when it comes to gestation, these guys will be pregnant for about 135 to 170 days. And that usually will give us a cute little baby, sometimes twins, of these little guys. and usually results in that. But sometimes they'll even have three. And the males will live in herds, numbering of up to 9 animals. But adult males are typically solitary, and females will live in herds uh, with adult females and their young. And they make all these alarm calls, which are actually quite similar to domestic goats, so that's why they don't sound too different. And early in the season, males and females may actually form together in open grassy patches and clear slopes for rutting and things like that, which is pretty cool. In terms of the subspecies and taxonomy, the one that this one is the Buranan Markhor. So these guys are found in like Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, with some populations kind of spread all over the place. They may possibly exist in the Darwas Peninsula in Afghanistan, but it's kind of, we don't really know where this particular subspecies is. And plus, subspecies is something that's like people can fight about forever. But we know that the populations, the Buranan Markhors, are kind of found within Turkmenistan and Tajikistan and potentially in Afghanistan. So in terms of threats, these guys are hunted and meat a lot, and there's a central part of wildlife parks as well. Poaching is a big issue for these guys, and that's really been facing the issues with populations. But luckily, they are considered near threatened, so they're not too endangered. They are definitely a conservation-dependent species, though, so people breed them in captivity to keep up with the hunting. So they often are considered the most challenging game, especially in British India. Even Elliot Roosevelt wrote that he shot 2 Markhor in 1881. And even though it is illegal to hunt Markhor in Afghanistan, they've been traditionally hunted a lot and may have been intensified during that war in Afghanistan. But in Pakistan, it's also legal to hunt them as you get licenses, things like that, and you're only allowed to hunt old Markhors. And it's illegal to hunt them in India as well. And Markhors have been successfully introduced into private game reserves in Texas, which is unlike the Aodad, blackbuck, Ngali, ibex, and axis deer. They've not established free roaming wild populations in Texas. So the IUCN typically classifies these guys as near threatened because the population in the wild is quite small, about 5,800 individuals or so. Let's have a look at the female while we talk about it. So it's believed to be that, and the absence of a projected total population decline and its reliance on ongoing conservation efforts. So they are considered near threatened, like they're not in danger because they're quite well regulated, but they are still a very conservation dependent species because of that, because they live in reserves, and there's poaching and things like that, and people trying to breed them in captivity as well and trying to use them sustainably. So they are protected in a lot of places, but they just don't have that many numbers yet, or they've kind of lost their numbers a bit. But yeah, still really cool. They're also the national animal of Pakistan as well, and they have all sorts of different names, especially local names. In Punjab, I believe they're called Najleg, I believe you say that. So a lot of interesting names and stuff for these guys. But yeah, really, really awesome mod. Nice to see this one get like a little bit of an update. So really, really cool. Have a look at the cute little kids when we have a look. Look at this cutie. Definitely deserved a nice update. So next up, we have got the Addax by Narwhal. So let's have a look at this wonderful guy here. So this is the Addax, been updated to fit the new scimitar horned oryx that's in the conservation pack. So the Addax, these guys are also known as the white antelope or the screwhorn antelope. These guys are native to the Sahara. So in terms of their history, the physical description, you can see they've got like a spiral horn going on there. Male Addax stand at about 105 to 115 centimeters, or about 41 to 45 inches at the shoulder, while females a little bit smaller, about 95 to 110 centimeters, or about 37 to 43 inches. And the sexual dimorphism is pretty much that males are slightly bigger than the females. The head to body length for both sexes is about 120 to 130 centimeters, about 47 to 51 inches, and they have about a foot added to their tails. The weight of males will vary a lot, between 100 to 125 kilograms, or about 220 to 276 pounds, and that females can get about 60 to 90 pounds, or 130 to 200 pounds, so slightly smaller. So you can see here the color of the Addax's coat actually varies a lot during the season. So in winter it can be grayish brown with white hindquarters. And then as you kind of get them in the summer, they get a lot whiter with kind of this grayish face but they still keep those long horns. But these horns, which are found in both males and females, they have 2 to 3 twists in them, are typically about 55 to 80 centimeters in, or about 22 to 31 inches in females, and males they get up to about 70 to 85 centimeters, or 28 to 33 inches in males. Though maximum recorded length is just over a meter, or about 43 inches, and you can see they've got the spiral to them, and it gets up quite tall. And they've got short tail, and they also have like scent glands in their feet and things like that. And in terms of their lifespan, these guys can live for up to about 25 years in captivity, but up to 19 in the wild as well. So it's quite cool. You can see they closely resemble the scimitar oryx, as I mentioned, but they can be distinguished a lot by their horns and markings, things like that, and also the spiral horns. In terms of their behavior and ecology, these guys are actually mainly nocturnal, particularly in the summer. In the day, they'll actually dig into the sand of sandy locations and kind of rest there, and that also protects them from sandstorms. Addax herds contain both males and females and have about 5 to 20 members. They generally stay in one place and only wander widely in search of food. The Addax also has a strong social structure that's based on age, and herds are led by older females. Herds are most likely to form on the northern edge of a tropical rain system during the summer and move north when winter falls. They're able to track rainfall and head to areas where vegetation is most plentiful, but males are also quite territorial and will guard females, and then females will establish their own dominance hierarchies. So these guys are typically a prey species for animals such as humans, lions, leopards, cheetahs, and African wild dogs, with caracal, silvers, and hyenas also attacking their calves. And they're not normally an aggressive species, but they may charge if they are disturbed. In terms of their adaptations to live in the desert, they can survive without water almost indefinitely, which is quite interesting, because they have a special lining in their stomach that allows them to store water in pouches, and they also have highly concentrated urine that allows them to conserve water as well. And the pale coat that they have, as you can kind of see here, the reason they have that is allows them to dissipate heat, so allows them to keep cooler as well, and then they'll be able to hide in shade areas, things like that. In terms of their diet, these guys will eat grasses and leaves and whatever shrubs they can manage to find. They're primarily grazers, but they will also browse, especially like acacia trees if there's no grasses. They also eat perennials and they pretty much eat what they can find, which is quite interesting. And they eat a lot of seeds as well. It's quite an important source of protein for these guys, which is quite interesting. In terms of their reproduction, females will generally reach sexual maturity at about 2 to 3 years of age, and males a little bit younger at about 2 years. Breeding will occur throughout the year, but it peaks during winter and early spring. In northern Sahara, they'll breed at the end of winter to the beginning of the summer, and it depends where you are in the Sahara with what times they'll breed. In a study, they actually showed that the blood serum of female addaxes were analysed and showed that estrus cycles about 33 days, and during that, the uterine horns are coiled as well, which is quite interesting. Typically, gestation lasts about 257 to 270 days at about 9 months, about the same as a person. And females may lie in or stand during delivery and give birth to one calf. The postpartum estrus lasts about 2 to 3 days. And the calf will weigh about 5 kilograms or 11 pounds at birth and is weaned at about 23 to 29 weeks. So let's have a look at this cute little baby while we're talking about it. Look at this little cutie. Definitely love this little guy. In terms of their habitats, these guys live in arid regions, semi-deserts, and stony deserts, where they live in extreme areas. They'll feed on habitat and toxic grasses. They used to live across the Sahara region of Africa, into the Nile Valley, and like pretty much lived all over the Sahara Desert. But sadly, they are much more restricted than they used to be, as we'll get into. But luckily, there are efforts to reintroduce them and things like that. Declining the populations of addax has been notable since the 1800s, and more recently they were found in Algeria and Sudan, from Algeria to Sudan, but they are much more restricted and rare now because of hunting. And they're easy to hunt because of their slow movements. Also, roadkill and firearms have really decreased their numbers. And their meat is also highly prized. And also, habitat degradation, more human settlements and agriculture has really hurt their populations. And typically, fewer than 500 individuals exist in the wild today, with most animals being found in Niger, Chad, and Matruna, I believe you say that. But luckily in captivity, there's lots of breeding programs. There's about 600 addaxes in Europe, North America, Japan, and Australia, and there's thousands more in private breeding collections such as like game reserves and ranches, things like that. So there's a lot of genetic diversity if needed, and there have been reintroduction efforts into the wild. So it's a great way of showing how captivity and breeding in captive areas and like zoos and private ranches are great for conservation as well. So it's really, really awesome to see these guys making their way back to the wild. So another really awesome mod done by Narwhal, definitely a big, big fan. So next up, we've got ourselves another one by Narwhal. We have got the Spectacled Bear. So I'm quite excited to take a look at this guy. And we've got a new color on this guy as well, a new morph. So here's the Spectacled Bear. So the Spectacled Bear, also known as the South American bear or the Andean bear or the Andean short-faced bear or just the mountain bear. These guys are a species of bear that lived in the Andes Mountains in northern and western South America, and the only living bear species that is native to South America, after things like the short-faced bears that lived that went extinct during the Pleistocene. So it's pretty interesting. So as I mentioned, they're the largest land carnivore in South America, and the only bear native there. But these guys, in terms of bears, these guys are pretty smallish. They're mid-size. They only are smaller. They're smaller than tapirs. Typically, you can see they've got this blackish fur with those. Some could be dark brown or reddish, as we'll have a look at another one. They also have distinct coloured markings on their face there, as you can see on their face. And these patterns can be slightly different from each individual bear, so that can help you tell them apart. Typically, males are a third larger than females and sometimes can be up to twice their weight. Males can weigh between 100 to 200 kilograms or 220 to 240 pounds, and females weigh between 35 and 80 kgs or about 77 to 181 pounds. Head to body length will typically range from 120 to 200 or 47 to 78 inches. The mature males typically measure less than 150 centimeters, and on average, males weigh about 115 kilograms and females about 65 kilograms. Thus, it rivals actually the polar bear being the most sexually dimorphic bear, which is quite interesting. There have been some individuals that are quite big and been found to be like 225 kilograms. This is a captive bear, an extreme example. And actually, compared to a lot of modern bears, they actually have a much rounder snout and broad snout as well, and quite shorter, as they are related to the short-faced bears. They kind of live in that family, and it was thought to be a adaptation for a more carnivorous diet. But these guys are actually much more herbivorous. They're very much almost like pandas in that regard, as we'll get into. They also have quite a strong sense of smell, and they can be perceived the ground when it's loaded to bear fruit, things like that, which is quite cool. As I mentioned, in terms of habitat, these guys live in the eastern Pantanal, but they're mostly restricted now into like Venezuela, western Bolivia, Argentina, things like that. They almost found exclusively in the Andean Mountains, but their populations have become fragmented throughout the last 500 years, but they have been quite a reputation of being adaptable. So luckily they are like surviving. They're doing okay-ish. They're vulnerable, but they're doing okay. They live in a great number of habitats. There's also, as the world brown bears like now occupy as well. So live in cloud forests, dry forests, high altitude grasslands, things like that. But their range has shrunk quite a bit. But they can be found above the snow line and pretty much everywhere within like top of the mountains to the bottom of the mountains, which is pretty cool. In terms of their naming, well, nowadays it's believed that these guys have been influenced a lot by people. So they used to live in areas where people live now, so like Venezuela, Ecuador, and Argentina. There may have been several populations there, but now they've become a lot more isolated and stuff like that, which also leads to their conservation status and a little bit of a concern for these guys. But in terms of the name, the spectacled bear, it's because their markings on their head and chest and things like that, as you can see there. So look, you probably get a better look. You can see it kind of looks like it's got spectacles, which is quite cute. In terms of its behavior and diet, the spectacled bear is one of the 4 bears that are living today that are like habitually arboreal, along with like sun bears and the both Asian and American black bears. And in the cloud forest, they spend most of their time active during the day and night, and they sleep during the day. But some they'll bed down during the day in the like Peruvian deserts, for example. And they're often found climbing in trees, things like that. And they usually will climb trees to get away from humans as well. And once they're on a tree, they'll often build a platform and like conceal themselves. And also they're solitary species, so they will As I mentioned, they're a solitary species that often spend a lot of time in by themselves, and they're not very territorial. They've been recorded to feed on in small groups and abundant food sources, so they will like gather together and they don't mind company too much. And they'll often shrink their ranges, and ranges will grow and change during the dry and wet season, depending on the availability of food. In terms of when they encounter humans, they will act docile but be cautious. And unless it's an intruder or it's seen as a threat to a mother's cubs, and then she will attack, of course. That's how bears are. The only predators really known for spectacled bears are cougars, and they tend to avoid jaguars, but they have considerably different habitats. They don't overlap too much. And there's only been one single human death attributed to a bear, which was a hunter that was already shot, which is quite interesting. Generally, the only threat to adult bears is humans, and they typically in the wild or in captivity, they've lived for about 36 years and 8 months. Their lifespan in the wild is believed to be about 20 years or so. They're also quite herbivorous. They're much more herbivorous than most bears, and only about 5 to 7% of their diet is meat. And the most common foods they'll eat is cactus, bromeliads, things like that, fallen fruits, moss, and things like that. They'll also peel bark to eat the nutritious second layer underneath. And much of this vegetation is quite tough, which has led to these species being these bears being one of the few species that can eat these because of their short muzzle that they got from their ancestry. It's kind of interesting. They also have the largest zygomatic mandibular muscles relative to their body size, and the shortest muzzle uh, of any living bear, which is slightly surpassing the giant panda. So both species are known for eating like quite fibrous plants, but these guys are slightly better at it, which is quite interesting. They'll also eat agricultural plants. They'll eat sugar cane and honey and maize and things like that. So they can be a bit of a pest for farmers. But generally, these guys are perhaps, besides the giant panda, these guys are could be the most herbivorous bear, even though they come from very carnivorous relatives. So that's quite interesting. In terms of their animal prey, these guys usually will eat quite small animals, but they've been known to eat adult deer, llamas, and cattle, also horses. They've also been seen hunting tapirs, but more commonly they'll eat rabbits, mice, rodents, birds in their nests like tinamous, arthropods, and carrion. And they have been known killing livestock, especially cattle, and raiding cornfields, which is part of the reason why people don't like them. But other than that, yeah, in terms of their reproduction, as we have a look at the reproduction, let's have the cute little baby. In terms of their reproduction, in captivity, the mating will kind of be concentrated between February to September through the latitude. In the wild, it may occur pretty much any time throughout the year. The activity normally peaks during the April to June, which is the beginning of the wet season, and shows where the fruits are ripening. The mating pair is together for about 2 weeks, where they'll copulate and then go up do their own thing. In the wild, births usually occur in the dry season between December and February, but in captivity can pretty much all through the year. The gestation period is about 5 to 8 months, and about 3 cubs may be born, with 4 being rare and 2 being the average. And their cubs are born with their eyes closed and weigh about 330 grams, or about 11 to 12 ounces each. And although the species does not hibernate during the hibernation cycle like northern bears do, these births will occur in a small den, and the mother will stay there until the cubs can see and walk. Also, females typically grow slower than males, and the size of litter has been possibly correlated with both the weight of the female and the abundance of food. So, partly the degree why fruiting is actually kind of predictable for them. And this is related to the time their mother breastfeeds. She'll often stay with their cubs for about a year, but then they'll even keep providing maternal care for another year. And breeding maturity is estimated to be about 4 to 7 years for both sexes, which is based only on captive bears. But females usually give birth for the first time when they're about 5 years old, and their fecundity is shorter than that of males, who keep fertile for all their life, and they can live up to 20 years in the wild. So very similar to other species of large predators, as I mentioned, they're vulnerable. They're threatened due to poaching and habitat loss, and also like trophy hunting, the pet trade, religious beliefs, and conflicts with agricultural and things like that. Agriculture's been a big thing for these guys. Also, there's been people killing bear biles for their gallbladders, which is quite high on the international market because the Chinese believe, obviously, bear bile's good for you. Logging's also a bad thing, but one big thing as well has been people hunting these bears because of their raiding livestock, like killing cattle and things like that, but also raiding crops, which has been another thing. But luckily, there have been some focus on their conservation. There's lots of protected areas. Most countries where they occur, they are protected. They've often been trying to protect high quality habitat for these guys, allow these populations to connect to each other, to allow them to breed. And these have been some found in Ecuador as well, which is quite interesting. So it shows that these guys do have the potential to recover. There's lots of people fighting for the protection of these bears, and protecting the habitats of a lot of other species will help these bears as well. So yeah, really, really awesome. You can see this kind of cool new morph that we've got as well. It's like a cinnamon bear. Really, really cool. So that's another mod done by Narwhal. Really done a wonderful job. So sadly, next up, we're moving on to some extinct species. Kind of a cautionary tale, we can say, for particularly this one. But we have got, this one is done by Harlequin's Ego, Hendrix, Leaf, and Narwhal. We have got the Thylacine, or the Tasmanian tiger. Oh, so let me just take a little break. The Thylacine, also known as kind of like the Tasmanian tiger or the Tasmanian wolf, these are extinct carnivorous marsupial that was native to the Australian mainland and to islands such as Tasmania and New Guinea. That's where it's got its name. So in terms of its history, these guys used to live in the Pleistocene. They used to live from New Guinea to Australia and Tasmania. But during the last 3,000 years, potentially due to dingoes or just climatic changes, they went extinct to New Guinea to Australia, and then they have only really survived in Tasmania, and that's where people found them. The closest living relative is also the numbat, which is pretty interesting, and they split, I believe. The modern Thylacine would have appeared during the early Pleistocene, and the closest relative, the numbat, they probably split about 20 or 30 million years ago, which is quite interesting. The only recorded species is the one that we know about. They typically, as you can see, they superficially really look like dogs and cats, but they're really more closely related to kangaroos and numbats than they are to cats and dogs, which is quite interesting. And they get their name Tasmanian tiger because of their kind of stripes going on there. So we have quite a lot preserved specimens and skeletons, so we have a pretty good idea of what they look like. These guys, you can see they've got a large dog-shaped head, but they also have a long tail, and they actually have a stiff tail like a kangaroo. Typically, a mature Thylacine gets about 100 to 130 centimeters, or 39 to 51 inches long, plus a tail that's about 50 to 65 centimeters, or about 20 to 26 inches. And adults typically stand at 60 centimeters, or about 24 inches tall, and can weigh between 8 to 30 kilograms, though I believe the average now is about 19 kilograms for males and about 13 for females. And you can see the skull actually looks quite a bit like the red fox, so that's quite interesting. And thylacines as well, which is unique for marsupials. They have large cartilaginous epipubic bones and highly reduced osseous element, which is actually quite interesting. This really tells you that they're like really interesting and different from placental mammals. And they have this yellowish brown coat, as you can see here, and these like 18 to 20 stripes going down their tail, which gives them the tiger. These stripes are actually much more pronounced in younger animals and fade as the animal gets older, which is quite interesting. They also have these rounded, erect ears, you can see like that, and actually suggests that these guys used to have quite a sense of hearing that allowed them to, and sense of smell, to allow them to detect prey. But analyses in the brain structure actually show that these guys didn't have that well of a developed olfactory bulb, so they weren't quite as good at smelling as other species, so they would have relied on sight and sound to hunt. Another really interesting about thylacines is that they were able to open their jaws to like 80 degrees, and even images of them yawning and things like that in the videos that we have of them. And they have really interesting jaws, and you see them go, really open their mouths, which is really cool. They also have quite muscular jaws, and they believe, though these jaws are too weak to kill sheep, these guys would have been great at killing wallabies, potentially even emus, things like that, but the sheep were probably too weak. And they had 46 teeth and quite muscular jaws. You can see their tails also tapered down, and in juveniles, they had a ridge on these tails. A female thylacine has a pouch, like other marsupials, and would probably have 4 teats. And unlike other marsupials, that actually open to the rear of the body, so they would basically come out looking like they're coming out of there, not like a kangaroo, which has it on its stomach, and they'll come out up to the chest. They'll come out down to the rear, out of the tail. And in males, this will actually have a scrotal pouch, unlike a lot of other marsupials, in which they actually put their scrotum in there for protection. And in terms of thylacine footprints, they can be quite easily distinguished from other animals like wombats, Tasmanian devils, something like that. They have a very large rear pad and four obvious front pads, which is almost like in a straight line. And they have actually been noted from videos and people that saw them, they're actually quite a stiff gait, or somewhat awkward gait. And they were quite unable to run at high speeds, but they will also perform a bipedal hop, quite similar to kangaroos, which is seen a lot in captive specimens when they were around. And in terms of their calls, they made like a yip yip or yap yap sound or hop 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 sound, which was primarily used for communication, like a long whining cry. It's been used to communicate with family members, things like that. And they also quite have a distinctive smell, like a faint animal odor, or some with no odor at all. And I believe they gave off this odor like Tasmanian devils when they were agitated, things like that. But in terms of their distribution and habitat, these guys would have likely lived in eucalyptus forests, wetlands, and grasslands in mainland Australia. And there's people showing like indigenous Australian rock paintings that show they used to live across Australia and New Guinea. And it's believed to be the last. They went extinct in Australia and New Guinea about 3,000 years ago, though there has been some evidence of these guys living on Kangaroo Island as well. But in Tasmania, they preferred the woodlands and coastal heath of the Midlands of the coastal heaths, and that's where they actually were more vulnerable to settlers because that's where the settlers like to be. But in terms of reproduction, there's actually evidence that these guys had some year-round breeding, although peak breeding season was in winter and spring. They will produce up to 4 joeys in a litter and carry these young in their pouch for up to 3 months and protect them until they're at least half adult size. Because they are marsupials, the young were pretty much born like little jelly beans and they crawl into their pouch and then kind of suckle and then grow up. And Thylacine's only bred once in captivity in the Melbourne Zoo in 1899, which was very sad. We already done it, only we did it more to save the species. But the expected life expectancy was estimated to be about 5 to 7 years in wild animals, but up to 9 in captivity, which is quite interesting. And actually, in 2018, they actually CT scanned all well-known, well-preserved Thylacine pouch young specimen that shows the entire window of growth within its mother's pouch. So it showed like they would have had new information about their biology, including the growth of its limbs and how it developed its dog-like appearance, which is quite interesting. But in terms of its feeding and diet, these guys would have been apex predators, and though exactly what large animals they could have eaten is disputed, they were nocturnal and crepuscular, so they would have been hunting at night or in the afternoon and evening, and would have been pretty much hiding, doing their own thing during the day. Early observers showed these guys were actually quite shy and secretive and try to avoid humans. And even though they had this fierce nature, they weren't really like that in reality. But we do know they were quite carnivorous, and in captivity, these guys have a clear preference for birds. In the wild, there would have been like Tasmanian native hens as well. That could have been why they went extinct, because native hens went extinct at that time as well in Australia. They would have been feeding on like megapodes, potentially even emus and things like that, and even like potentially Dromaeothornis, like a Gistornis, which is quite a big bird. But they lead to potentially feed on like Tasmanian emus, maybe in cassowaries when their range is kind of aligned. And however, the emus are more vulnerable because of the bipedal hop and things like that. There's some controversy over the prey size of a thylacine. Some think they would only eat small animals like possums or bandicoots, which would have put them in more direct competition with things like quolls and devils. But it's believed that these guys could have eaten potentially smaller prey as well. But however, there's been research to show that they had a bite force quite similar to quolls, and modern mammalian periods, these guys would have had eating animals as large or larger than themselves. So these guys were probably feeding on wallabies, larger animals, things like that, which is quite interesting. And they suggest that these guys were potentially pursuit predators. That's what their anatomy shows. But trappers suggest they were ambush predators, and they may have lived in small family groups, and they would have been herding prey into an ambush, things like that. And the predatory behavior of thylacines was potentially closer to like felids than like pursuit canids. And their stomachs were muscular and could eat a lot of food and things like that. When in captivity, they'll feed on all sorts of things like rabbits and wallabies, as well as poultry, mutton, horse, and things like that. But we got to talk about their extinction. So they first went extinct. Let's have a look at the babies while we talk about their extinction. Kind of a little morbid thing to go on, but still. They first died out in the Australian mainland. So Australia lost most of its megafauna from about 40,000 years ago. And then they lost the thylacine about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And it's, people believe that could have been the dingo, but it also could have been just habitat changes. Also, the extinction of the native hen and Tasmanian devils may have been a part of it. It's probably just changed. The habitat changed potentially as the world got a little bit warmer. Habitats they liked, especially with Australia becoming more arid. Potentially, a lot of the habitats the thylacines like just didn't exist anymore, and they went extinct locally. But the story of how they went extinct in Tasmania is a lot sadder. So they were, even though they died out on mainland Australia, they were doing pretty well in Tasmania until the 1930s. And then the human settlements came around, and they believed to be about 5,000 living on Tasmania at the time. But then people put a bounty on them because people were thinking that they were hunting their sheep, and they put a bounty on them. And they pretty much hunted them until like the beginning of the 20th century, where they were pretty much people were catching the zoos as well. There were attempts to breed them, but like sadly they kind of went extinct about 1936, I believe. The last captive thylacine lived in Hobart Zoo and died in 1936 on the 7th of September. So this individual was named Benjamin, even though it was identified as actually originally a female. Identified as a male, but is actually a female, so she could have been bred. And a really tragic story. There's lots of videos of her, especially in Hobart Zoo, running around and doing things. But yeah, sadly, she died in 1936, and sadly, she was just extinct at that point. They didn't really care too much. And there had been, from the really early, like 1901, there'd been a conservation movement like pressing to try and protect the thylacine because people were like, oh shit, these guys are actually endangered, we should protect them. But sadly, we just kind of like lost it. We thought they were prosecuted unfairly for hunting sheep and things, and by the time the conservationists were like, yeah, we need to preserve some thylacines, they basically went extinct, which is really sad. And there has been a lot of hope. People have been, there's been research suggesting that thylacines may have went extinct a little later, and people are still out there, whether they're actually really into it or not. They've reported thylacine sightings, but it's kind of become a cryptid anyway. But one thing as well is these guys have been a lot of talk of cloning thylacines. Like de-extinction is something that's been on the mind of a lot of conservationists and scientists recently. And there have been people managing to fully sequence the thylacine of the thylacine genome and things like that. So there has been people really pushing to de-extinct these guys and potentially eventually breed them in captivity and then release them into Tasmania and bring back an extinct species. So that's really, really cool. But after their extinction, they've kind of become a cultural icon, especially in Australia. The Tasmanian coat of arms actually has thylacines on them, and lots of Aboriginal cultures that kind of report thylacines as well. But it's quite sad, the story of their extinction. But luckily, they may have a second chance depending how efforts on de-extincting them goes. So yeah, really, really interesting. But yeah, really do love the thylacine. Kind of a really great animal to talk about in terms of conservation and like how we lost it, because it's such a tragic story. But luckily, it could very well, with the extinction, have a very happy ending. So yeah, really, really cool animal. I just love thylacines. It's so different and interesting. I can see why a lot of people really, really like them. So yeah, that was done by, as I mentioned, Harlequin's Ego, Hendrix, Leaf, and Narwhalo. Really did a wonderful job with that thylacine. But next up, we've got another species, another extinct species. So this one went extinct a little bit before the thylacine. So we've got here Glyptodon. So let's have a look at these guys. So we'll have a look at one in here. There we are. So this is Glyptodon, which means grooved or carved teeth. These guys are a genus of Glyptodon, which were a group of giant herbivorous armadillos. They lived during the Pleistocene and died out during the early Holocene about 11,000 years ago. And they lived in Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, pretty much a lot of places in South America. So in terms of their discovery, these guys were first discovered in 1814, and then like found with the Megatherium, things like that. And they've been collected from Pleistocene age rocks, things like that. And all sorts of different names. They've been around for like 200 years, so there's been lots of species named. The species this is based off is, I think, is Glyptodon reticulus, which is often considered the lesser Glyptodon, which is a common name, kind of. But yeah, a lot of people research these guys and name different species, like Glyptotherium is another great example. But these guys have a long and storied past, as we probably won't go into. The type species Glyptodon glaviparus was described in 1839 by Sir Richard Owen, and then it's split into other species like Glyptotherium is another genus as well of these guys. In terms of their geography and habitat, these guys, I'll talk to their relatedness, these guys are a type of xenarthran, so they are a type of armadillo. These guys extracted, DNA has actually been extracted for these guys to show that these guys are not that closely related. They're actually more closely related to like fairy armadillos, which is quite interesting, and they have this large size and gigantism as probably part of their niche. In terms of how they're related, there's like different species in flux because taxonomy being taxonomy, but they are more closely related to those smaller fairy ones, which is quite interesting. In terms of their range, they used to live in South America, and they originated in South America, and then remains have been found from Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, and there's been different species found. Our species Reticulus would have been found in southern Brazil. But due to poor morphology, we kind of really don't know exactly what Glyptodon, things like that. It's kind of taxonomy being taxonomy, I guess. Typically, the habitats these guys would have liked, though, is like forested areas, subforest, and warm and humid. And they would have also liked grasslands as well. And also, that would have depended a lot on different species. And a close relative and what was once considered Glyptodon is Glyptotherium, which is a close relative. And they managed to get into the US during the Pleistocene, so about 2.5 million years ago, which is quite cool. But in terms of their feeding and behavior, there's mainly two main groups of Glyptodonts, kind of described by their feeding habits. So the smaller early Miocene ones would have had quite narrow muzzles, so these large post-Miocene ones, which includes Glyptodon, would have had quite wider muzzles. So these larger Glyptodonts would have been bulk feeders, much more like grazers, so they've been grazing around and feeding on things. And you can tell a little bit of the ecology. It's also believed that these guys may have had either large lips, and some people even suggested a trunk, though I believe that's kind of not considered the case because there's a lot of extra things of musculature to have a trunk. But big lips is definitely something they would have had, like mobile lips to allow them to better eat, grab grasses and eat, almost similar to like a white rhino is probably a good comparison. And they would have been like chewing their food at a side-to-side motion, very much like most other mammals do today. And like most xenarthrans, because their body runs at a lower body temperature, they would have had a much lower energy requirement than a lot of other mammals, which actually means they could live on lower intakes of food compared to a lot of herbivores of a similar size. So that's quite interesting. In terms of ontogeny, let's have a look at these cute little babies. Cute little baby Glyptodon. So there's been a prenatal individual found inside the carapace of a Douc, which is quite interesting. So we know what they kind of looked like. The skull was quite small, only about 51 millimeters. And these guys actually would have been quite similar to like Glyptotherium. They very interesting anatomy as babies. And the osteoderms of juvenile individuals were actually larger. The central figures were larger than the prenatal osteoderms. And they would have like kind of been a little bit weaker. They would have been weakly marked and things like that. And kind of like hardened up as they became adults. There's no evidence of sexual dimorphism within Glyptodon, but has been observed in Glyptotherium based on fossils found like Arizona, things like that. And also, rare rod monochromy has actually been a rare condition that's seen in eyes of vertebrates, which results in color blindness. So it's very likely that these guys would have most likely been out at night or in twilight and lived while in burrows. However, these guys may have actually been around during the day because of the darkness of like the understory of South American rainforest, things like that. And typically, the large size and no, that's not what we're looking at. The large size and armor would have protected these guys from a lot of predators, except jaguars. And there's believed that these long tails that they have there would have been used for intraspecific combat and potentially fighting each other. There's actually a Glyptodont found with damage on the surface of the carapace, which has potentially been done by other Glyptodons, fighting for their territory or potentially fighting for females or even predators as well, which is quite interesting. So in terms of their anatomy and descriptions, things like that, they've got this large carapace you can see there, and they've got these hexagonal osteoderms or bones within the skin. They create that. So it isn't quite like a turtle shell where it's hard like that. It's a lot little, so it gives them a little bit more flexibility, but they would have had like a carapace going around them with these small hexagonal osteoderms, with Glyptodon having about 1,800 osteoderms within their carapace. And their armor is actually quite different from extant armadillos, though it would have been pretty much sturdy, so it would have been much more like a turtle shell than like modern armadillos where they have the bands that give them more movability. These guys pretty much would have been like a round dome, and quite similar to turtles in that regard, though not quite as like they don't have those huge osteoderms uh, on their ribs, things like that. These would have been like bones in the skin that kind of form around them to create the carapace. Quite similar but different in a lot of regards. Similar relatives like Dudicurus had also like quite large tails as well to be able to swipe at prey, things like that. They also have very stout legs, you can see, that were quite good for weight bearing, and they would have had these large claw sheaths and would have had a morphology basically in between like claws and hooves, so they potentially would have been digging a lot as well. And very gravipodal. Glyptodon species would have varied a lot in size between individuals as well. Uh, I believe Clavigus would have been about 401. Reticulus would have been the smallest one, but was actually 401 kilograms or 884 pounds, or about 862 kilograms or 1900 pounds. So a lot of them were it's kind of the middle species, but still quite big. The largest species, the type species, would have weighed about 2 tons. And the size difference between could be between different habitats. So it could have been a species living more in open lowland areas and one living in the Andes, having smaller. But it's quite interesting. The reticulus would have been about 7 feet in its like carapace length, and about 2.19, about 7 feet. So still quite a big animal. As I mentioned, these guys don't have kind of canines or incisors like a lot of other animals. These guys would have had hypsodont teeth, which would be quite similar to those of like sloths and things like that, which is quite interesting. But you can see they have quite heavy muscle attachments and their skull there. And it's believed they may have had like a trunk similar to a tapir elephant, but they probably didn't have the muscles for it. But the teeth look much more like that of an armadillo, which had these like fluted with deep grooves, which allowed them to bite through plants rather effectively. It potentially would have been growing. As I mentioned, we got that big carapace, that large, and all the little osteoderms on there, which is quite cool. In terms of the tail, you can see it's got these bony rings you kind of see around there, which allowed for a little bit of flexibility. And other species of Glyptodonts, like Didicurus, they would have had a big tail club at the back there, using that potentially to swing at each other, which we have evidence of as well, because there's like dents and Glyptodon kind of carapaces from other Glyptodonts or other Didicurus, and also potentially for predators as well. So Glyptodon is quite primitive in that regard, where they really only had 8 or 9 of these rings around their vertebrae. But obviously, you mentioned other species like Didicurus, which are more advanced, quote unquote, Glyptodonts. They would have had clubs and things like that to hurt other animals with. But in terms of predation, these guys, because of their large size and large carapace, they would have been pretty invulnerable to most predators. Though there are evidence of some species preying on them, such as Smilodon, which is obviously a large saber-toothed cat. Jaguars with quite a strong bite. They've got the strongest bite of pretty much any living cat, I think. So there have been evidence of suggested that these guys would kind of bite in between their necks and kind of break their necks and then eat them. And then these canid Protocyon would have existed in these areas and kind of hunted on these guys. But looking at isotopes, it's actually found that Glyptodons were actually living in denser forests rather than the open areas of animals such as like Macrocenia or the sloth Lestodon. These guys would have been living in more closed habitats like forests. So these guys would have been less likely to be within the habitats of animals like Smilodon to be preyed upon, but obviously more likely preyed upon by jaguars. But so yeah, that shows like just the ecology and things like that. Living in more close habitats means they weren't as available to be preyed upon by Smilodon and more like jaguars compared to other species. So that really shows all the cool ecology that we know just from bones and isotopes and things like that. So that's really cool. And they probably were very likely hunted by early humans that went into South America. So like obviously there would have been Homo sapiens, but like early South Americans would have been down there, and there's been evidence of them being hunted, especially with butchered by humans as well. And Didicurus, which is quite a large glyptodon, were hunted as well. And there also been carapace, a partial carapace that was found in Venezuela, which was pretty much eviscerated by humans as well, which is quite cool. But in terms of their extinction, there's been lots of, like, similar to other Ice Age megafauna, people are like, why did these guys go extinct? But there's a lot of evidence that suggests that potentially humans drove them to extinction because humans may have used their shells as shelters. Also, evidence of butchery, things like that, and it's potentially Didicurus and other glyptodons may have survived up to the early Holocene and may have coexisted with humans for a minimum of about 4,000 years. But also could have been other changes such as climate change, especially with the world becoming warmer, maybe changes in habitat, maybe these like forests kind of got too dense for them to live in or something like that. Though these guys did prefer closed habitats rather than open ones, so you would think they would probably benefit more from more forests rather than the grasslands. So potentially humans may have played a role in that. Some other things like dating this, it's the Pleistocene, like the end extinction, like that Pleistocene extinction is being debated, like what the exact causes, but likely it would have been a combination of factors, including climate change, humans, maybe disease. There's been talks about disease like anthrax, things like that. But yeah, really, really cool animal. Really nice to see Glyptodon come to Planet Zoo. So this guy was done by TNT, your old friend TNT, and Leaf probably coded it for him. So yeah, really, really awesome mod. Definitely love seeing extinct animals. Love Glyptodons. So yeah, I think this would be a great place to end the video. So I really, really, really hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to hit the little bell icon to get notified if I upload anything. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe, and bye-bye.